Good afternoon. Hello, welcome back. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's Chief Tech Correspondent. And welcome back to Politico AI's penultimate session here at the AI Summit. We're touching on a topic that I find fascinating is misinformation and the use of it in AI. But before we get into our excellent panelists, I just want to do a few housekeeping things. We want to make sure this is an event that is interactive as possible. So please submit your questions to Swapcard. I'll try and get to as many of them as I can. Also, there's a poll up there to take a look at too. We'd love to get your thoughts on that. And finally, because there's always a hashtag, please put your thoughts towards us at hashtag PoliticoAI. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our panelists and get onto this discussion.
Done.
First, we have Roger Taylor. Roger Taylor, the chair of the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation here in the United Kingdom. Also, Samuel Woolley joining us from the US, from the University of Texas at Austin. And then finally, Crystal Chavels, who is a Danish MEP who's helping to shepherd through the EU's Digital Services Act proposals through its legislative process. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we have a good interactive conversation. I want to start off with you, Roger, if I may. A lot of the discussion is going to be around what is AI and how that relates to misinformation. I think you guys have been doing some really good, interesting work on online targeting and what that actually means in terms of how people see content displayed in social media feeds, both sort of maybe harmful misinformation and regular posts from their parents. I just want to get a sense from you to get the conversation going. What are you seeing? What are people's thoughts in terms of how they're being targeted? Are they happy with these so-called machine learning tools sort of serving up information to them? And what are they looking for in terms of extra transparency in how that content is served up every day?
A very good question. And just to introduce myself, I should say I'm chairing an organisation called the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, set up by the UK government. It's an independent advisory body for the government on the use of technology. So I'm not speaking for the UK government here. I'm speaking on behalf of the CDEI and some of the work that we've done and the advice we have offered to government. And there are currently policies being developed and new legislation being brought to Parliament to deal with some of the issues we're going to talk about today. But to say a little bit about the work that the CDEI has done on this, we did look at online targeting, and one of the things we were very keen to do, as you say, is understand what people think about this. And so we organised these group discussions, and it's quite a hard thing because people on the whole don't know an awful lot about how these systems operate. So there was we had people come along for 2 full-day sessions about 2 weeks apart. The first of which was a lot of explaining to people how things work and getting their sense of that, and then coming back in a couple of weeks after trying some things at home and to talk a bit more fully about what they felt. And what came out of that was a strong sense that people think targeting technology is beneficial. They certainly are strongly opposed to the idea that you could just stop people doing this, because they recognize that's what makes many of the applications they enjoy in the social media platforms as effective as they are. So they don't want this. They're against the idea, or most people are against the idea of simply saying this is a bad thing and should stop. But most people do not trust that platforms are using these systems responsibly. And the more that they understand about how powerful they are and what they're capable of doing, the greater their concerns become. And the concerns, a great deal of concern around the notion of vulnerability. So particularly in regard to children being manipulated, ideas are, mental health was an issue that came up frequently. As always with these kinds of discussions, people tend to think that they're relatively safe from being manipulated, and their concern is often expressed in terms of concern about others. But I think there was a widespread recognition that this is an area that does need reform, and that they do want platforms to be held to account for what they're doing, and recognizing that there are tensions there. There's important ethical tensions between freedom of speech and people feeling safe. They would like to have a great deal more control over how this operates on them personally. We found that very few people found the existing privacy controls of much use to them. They didn't tend to use them, and when they tried to use them, they found them very difficult to use. So a deep sense of dissatisfaction with where we are right now.
Oh, that's a good way to start. Crystal, maybe I just turn to you because I think some of this comes down to transparency, right? Because whatever we see in our social media feeds, both good or bad, is done through machine learning tools, a lot of automation, many of which is done in use my very technical term, a black box. Part of the Digital Services Act proposals that are coming through Brussels right now is about trying to open that up and provide greater transparency. As someone who's helping sort of shift that through the parliament now, what would you like to see happen in terms of the platforms being held more accountable and more transparent to Roger's perspective to make sure we are mitigating some of these harms?
Well, first of all, I think that the Commission's proposal on DSA is a good starting point, and it is a tool we can use. But I think we also need to go further than just talking about transparency. We need exactly to talk about accountability as well. So what I find important is that we need first to make sure that the platforms are making kind of a risk assessment in the use of their algorithms. And we need to make sure that the way they are using their algorithms is not, neither giving cause for concerns about fundamental rights or leading people into dark patterns or rabbit holes or whatever we call them. So I think that it is important that the platforms tells in general what they're doing, but we also need someone to look into whether they are doing what they're saying they're doing. So I think that the Commission, the EU Commission, needs to have access to the algorithms, and I think it is important that not just the Commission, but researchers and maybe even some representatives from the civil society needs to have access. And then I think that the platforms need to explain what they're doing with their algorithms. What are they doing in order to make sure that if they have to make this explanation, they might also be more aware of what is happening. What I fear is that we kind of get misleading, that the recipients or users of the platforms end up being misled or even used in order to create disinformation. So I think accountability is important.
Samuel, I see you're nodding your head there, but I feel that there's a bit of a balance to be made in terms of, right for people to have greater access to this data and these algorithms to see what's being promoted and published. But also, I would be concerned from a freedom of speech perspective, right? Because these algorithms, to Roger's point earlier, are beneficial. They are serving up content that people want. There are some harms baked in here. So what is that balance? How do you balance out the different needs and rights that people have to this?
Well, seen from my perspective, I think it is that.
Sorry, Crystal. I'll come to you in a minute. It's just Samuel. I wanted to get his input on this, and we'll come back to you in a second.
Sure. So, there's a lot to balance here. I think the main two things that we're balancing are the right to freedom of expression or freedom of speech, which here in the United States is a massive thing, and is equally a big thing in Europe, with the right to freedom of thought. This is something that I was actually recently listening to Dr. Joe Lepore's Last Archive podcast, which is fantastic for those of you who haven't listened to it, where she talks about the rise of doubt. And I don't think that we think enough about this idea of the right to freedom of thought and the ways in which doubt has begun to pervade our society, particularly in the information age, particularly in the era where anyone can quote unquote be a journalist, where also anyone can quote unquote be a propagandist. And so simultaneous to, needing to protect people's freedom of speech and freedom of thought, we also have to think about what it is we're moderating and how we're using AI to do that moderation. So it's not just that AI gets used as a tool to spread mis and disinformation. It's that AI gets used in the moderation process. But while we're doing that, we have to think about, do we moderate propaganda? Do we moderate disinformation? For instance, do we moderate targeted political harassment or trolling? Do we moderate electoral falsehoods? We've seen a lot of electoral falsehoods spread in Europe and the United States and around the world. And then another question is, how do we balance the need for AI moderation alongside human moderation? Because we know that our AI tools are not perfect. We know that they don't detect as much nuance as we would like. And so how do we bring humans into this, particularly when it's culturally specific disinformation or propaganda? So if it's culturally specific spreading in Germany or France, we probably need people looking into that unless we have highly targeted AI. And then finally, one other thing that we need to think about is this concept of transparency. Yes, I like this idea of looking into audits for moderating algorithms, but we've got to balance the need for open data alongside the need for national security, but also individual privacy, particularly of victims of these sorts of attacks. So we have to, there's a lot of things hanging in the balance here as we work through this.
Mm. Chris, I'll maybe just come back to you on the balance question, because I think this does go key to what's happening in Brussels right now in terms of sort of balancing people's needs and requirements. I mean, how do you see that, to Samuel's point about balancing those variety of different and sometimes contradictory needs when you're putting together the Digital Services Act?
Well, it's certainly not an easy task, but I think that, you know, we need transparency, but it's not the fact. I don't believe that every users of the platforms need to know every detail about the algorithm. That's impossible. But I mean, those who is going to make sure that our regulation is in fact complied in a good manner. For instance, the EU Commission or the digital service coordinators of the member states, they should have access. And the balance could maybe come also by the fact that it's not just about looking into how the patterns works, etc., but also making sure that the fundamental rights are met, so that you have to look into how it works on a lot of areas. And in that respect, I think that you also need, you will get the balance there. So if you look into, of course, transparency and making sure that you don't create too many dark patterns, because that's not good for the society. But if you do that, you might narrow down the right to speak freely or think freely, and therefore the Commission also has to look into whether this is compromised or not. So I think when you look into whether the algorithm works or not, then you will have to find a balance there. But it's, of course, not an easy task.
Roger, how do you see this playing out in the UK? They have obviously they have their own online safety bill coming through, and that it hits on some of these points. I mean, what is the role of a regulator versus an average punter? Because frankly, although I know the area, I wouldn't be able to know my way around an algorithm, and I'd suggest that many other people don't. So I mean, there is a balance here, because you again need to have the technical expertise to do this, but also not do it in a way that limits freedom of speech.
Absolutely right. And so the current proposals for legislation in the UK, the approach that's been taken to some of these issues is firstly that there should be a principles-based regulator. The last thing we want is, as it were, government trying to make editorial decisions as to what platforms should or shouldn't be doing. It should be a mechanism in which there are principles, not unlike traditional media regulation principles, ideas such as, you know, balance and truthfulness, recognizing that truth is not necessarily as useful a concept as it's sometimes thought to be in these situations. You know, a lot of misinformation can take the form of truthfully factual statements. But one of the first things we said is obviously that there needs to be a balancing duty against the protection from harm to respect rights to freedom of speech. Perhaps going into a bit more detail on that point, one of the things to recognize is there's enormous difference between the idea of people being having content removed from a platform and content being promoted by the design of the platform, and in particular, the use of algorithmic recommendation systems. So if we take something like anti-vaccination content, it is not illegal, and obviously should not be illegal, for people to say they believe vaccines harm people, or that they believe their children have been harmed by a vaccine, and to recommend that people don't. These are not things that should be illegal. It is right that a platform should have a view as to what it will tolerate with regard to information, and that's an editorial choice that a platform is entitled to make within reasonable limits, and to be transparent about what they're doing there. But there's a very different standard applies to when an algorithm adopted by a platform chooses to promote, say, that same piece of content to several 100,000 people. At that point, the responsibility for the platform changes quite dramatically. You know, another consideration in deciding this is, of course, what is the intent? If it's a citizen honestly expressing their opinion, that seems to be something they have a right to do. If it is part of a coordinated campaign that with a malicious intent, that is quite a different situation. Now, these are very subtle things to tell the difference between, and it is very clear, I think, that we are never going to be able to understand this enough to be able to regulate it appropriately without there being mechanisms to access how these systems are actually operating. So that power does need to be given to regulators. And again, the UK legislation is recommending that is done, but it also has to be done in a way that clearly respects citizens' privacies, because these are communications between citizens that are effectively being looked at by an arm of the state. So it must be done in a way that people can guarantee it is not being used to manipulate them in a way that is exactly as what we're trying to protect against. So there's some difficult balances here, but it requires, I think, a regulatory structure in which there's some overarching principles, and then the platforms taking appropriate editorial responsibility for what they're doing, being sufficiently transparent to be held to account, and being held to account by an independent and appropriately structured regulator.
Samuel, I just want to come to you, because for what was just described is incredibly difficult for any algorithm or machine learning tool to do. And I sometimes feel that we have this concept that Facebook and Google have some sort of Minority Report screen where they're sort of doing sort of 22nd century, technology, but it's not that. It's very, frankly, very stupid right now. And you mentioned before about the requirement and need for human moderators to still be involved in this, particularly in non-English language, where frankly the platforms haven't done that well. Can you just maybe explain what you sort of elaborate on that? Because I think it's a very interesting point that as much as AI and machine learning tools are interesting and very relevant, there is still a very sort of hands-on manual approach that needs to be done in the gray area that Roger just described.
Sure. So I think it's important to note that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to discussions around AI. There's hype, or it's overblown when it comes to discussing the ways in which AI gets used to spread mis and disinformation. In fact, early in my career, I was at University of Oxford as the research director of the Computational Propaganda Project, and we studied the ways that bots were being used. So automated profiles were being used to amplify misinformation or disinformation. And what we found most of the time was that they were automated, but they were not artificially intelligent. They were actually very clunky, very basically built, because propagandists and those working to spread coordinated misinformation and disinformation are pragmatic. They're pragmatists. They spend the least amount of money to get the job done that they need to get done. Simultaneously, I think that there's an over-reliance or an overhyping when you see Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey sitting in the chair before the US Congress of them saying AI is going to be the solution to all of our problems. Well, if you understand, much about AI, one of the first things you'll understand is that AI is not a panacea. It is not going to fix everything, because it's not particularly advanced in the way we think of it as in like science fiction, the Terminator, all of the Matrix, all of these sorts of things. That's not the AI we have. And so, the human brain and human understandings of culture and society are really important to pair with AI. AI allows us to scale our efforts to fight back against disinformation or purposefully spread false content, while the humans working with the AI help us to bring in that nuance and that cultural specificity.
I'm glad to see we've gone 20 minutes into the conversation before Skynet was mentioned, so that's good. Thank you for that. Crystal, I just want to come back to this idea that many of your colleagues in the Commission talk about this not wanting to create a ministry of truth. And I look at the digital services proposals, and I look at the requirements put on the platforms and the oversight that's coming from both those in Brussels and national regulators. And I just want to, where do you see the balance there? Again, I keep using this word balance, but I think it's very key, because I would feel very uncomfortable any sort of government regulator or minister being able to sort of regulate what I'm seeing on a social platform because of the gray area that we've described. So where do you think those regulators sit, both at the EU level and the national level, to make sure that we aren't having government officials, dictating what I and others can see on social media?
No, but of course, I mean, it's extremely important that we don't see this, political decision about what we would like citizens to users of the platforms to see. However, I also have to say that I'm not completely trustful towards the private sector either on this, because it's only about money. And apparently we have seen some of the big platforms not really being able to find and strike the right balance. But what I think is important is that we should decide in this DSA legislation that what is illegal offline should be illegal online. But we shouldn't go in and regulate harmful content, even though there's a lot of harmful content that we don't like, I don't like, others don't like. It might not be the same, but we shouldn't really regulate on what is harmful and what is not harmful. But what we should ask of the platforms is that they need to be specific and aware, and they need to be able to explain what they're doing with the algorithms, how they are using the algorithms in the recommender system, how do they nudge the users into certain areas. They should be able to explain it. They should give access to what they're doing to researchers and authorities. And then, of course, if this use of AI and these patents goes in a direction where they are misleading or even creating disinformation towards the users, then, of course, we need them to act. But we shouldn't say what they should do, but we need them to be reliable. So I think that it's very important that we shouldn't have this minister of truth or whatever you call it. That would be unlikely. But the Commission, EU Commission and the member states need to look into whether the balances have been reached. And in that, for instance, the fundamental rights of the citizens, the right to speak freely, and of course, on the other side also, the right to make sure that we are not doing any harm to our society and to democracy. So we need to have balances inside this. And I think it is not easy, but I think it is important that we demand by the platforms that they do something. We have the authorities to check into whether they're doing it, but what they're doing specifically, we should not decide. And I hope what I'm saying here is understandable. Illegal, down and away, harmful, well, look into how it works and make sure that you tell us what you're doing and how to avoid creating these dark patterns with the algorithms. That is what I hope we can achieve with the DSA.
Roger, I just want to come to you on this because I keep coming back to the word transparency, and it seems key to everything we're discussing. And a lot of this is about auditing the content moderation approaches of the platforms. Again, to Crystal's point, leave it to the platforms to decide, but also have checks and balances in place to make sure they are doing it right. Can you just walk us through what would that look like? What would an audit of a content moderation system look like, either within the EU system, UK system, or another, so we can kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here?
So the two things to say about this, one of which is kind of give you a sense of what that would look like and the challenges we still have to overcome to make that work. But I also would say make a couple of comments about the limitations of that and what else needs to be around it, or other avenues we should be thinking about. But so an audit approach makes sense if you can clearly identify a type of harmful content, and you believe that you can identify it sufficiently accurately, presumably using an AI to try and track all the instances of this. Or you might be looking for a particular, one incident and how that's been maybe filmed and promoted. But more often you're going to be thinking about a type of content, so you're going to have some way of categorizing it, identifying it, and then understanding how an algorithm has promoted that and to who. Now, the mechanism by which this is actually done, the technical way in which you ask that question and come up with an answer, particularly given the fact that every platform operates differently, there's a huge amount of work just to do to get our heads around how this is going to operate. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing I just want to say is the number of situations where that is clearly a viable strategy is much smaller than the number of things about which there is current widespread public concern. So, for example, the issues such as impacts on mental health, things around sort of impact on political polarization, issues such as the degree to which content can take you down a rabbit hole into extremist beliefs. We have a bigger problem there in the sense of just establishing the kind of research base to even understand how we define those problems more specifically in terms of the operation of a platform. And so one of the things we were keen to make differentiate in our recommendations was between the idea of sort of outside audit to establish compliance with some kind of regulation, and how information of that sort could inform a regulator's decisions as to whether a platform was behaving within a code, versus the kind of the situations where it's more we're at the position of really trying to want to establish, is this thing happening at all? And quite often there's a legitimate need to try and establish whether a widespread perceived harm, the scale and extent to which it is occurring, which is not to inform regulatory action, it's simply to inform better understanding. So we think that aspect is important. But I just wanted to mention two other aspects which came up important and were widely thought by the public to be important. The first is the very obvious point that is always made, but should always be stressed, which is simply about education and people getting smart at understanding how information is being fed to them and the agendas of the people who may be feeding it to them. So just as we've all learnt to better understand the press and how to navigate the press and how to regulate the press, similarly, there is a job to do there in terms of getting everybody in society up to speed with the systems they interact with every day. And then the last element of this is actually how you can empower the individual to better protect themselves. And there's some things there. I think there's some scope around the way systems are designed, and we're doing a bit of research into those sorts of issues at the moment. That's one area. And of course, the other area is the degree to which you are captive on a platform, or the degree to which different models of data ownership and structures would provide another mechanism for people to be able to better control how they interact with digital media. And those aspects to it, I think, often kind of get downgraded while we all focus on the regulation problem. But I think they are in the long run will be equally important.
The problem is digital media literacy isn't a sexy topic, whereas algorithmic transparency and audits weirdly are. So, Crystal, I see you nodding your head. I'll come to the media literacy question to you in a second. But before, Samuel, you spent a lot of your time at the nasty edges of the internet. And I suppose the question is, do you think some sort of greater transparency around algorithms would reduce the amount of misinformation that people see in their social media feeds? Is that something that actually will have benefits and be successful?
I think the simple answer is yes, because the platforms at the moment are doing what they were built to do, right? Like, so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it, they're built to prioritize certain kinds of information, to show it to people, and to sell advertisements. That's the bottom line, right? And so if we have algorithmic audits that work correctly, if we have public interest technologists, people that understand the way that the code works and the way that society may or may not react in a social scientific way, then we can actually hold the platforms more accountable, and we can work to regulate the platforms more effectively. Because at the moment, what's happening is sort of a trust-based mechanism that doesn't really function very effectively, because what we're saying effectively is these platforms, these companies should be let to do what they're doing, and we should trust that they will do what they're going to do. But it's not happening. It's not happening quickly enough. It's not happening in the right way. And so algorithmic audits provide us one mechanism through which we can actually work to hold them accountable and control the system a little bit more. And I use that word control not lightly, because I understand that part of the problem that we face here is the control of speech and the control of expression. But what I would say is that there has to be some sensible regulation at this stage, not just in the EU, but also in the United States and elsewhere.
You might be waiting a while in the US, but we'll see. Crystal, can I just come to you on the literacy question? Because again, it's not the fanciest or hottest of topics, but I think it is important that as much as the platforms do need to be held more responsible, to Samuel's point, us as social media users also need to be able to be more aware and take some responsibility in terms of what we see. So how do you see that? Again, my favorite word of this conversation is balance, but how do you see those two things balancing out?
Oh, well, we need to do both. We need to make the platforms accountable for their algorithms. We need authorities to look into whether they're doing what they're saying they're doing. But of course, we also need to make sure that users of the platforms, citizens, are more aware of what is happening and patterns, etc. And I think that we really need to learn. Maybe it's stupid that I'm saying it, being old. And kids being more and young people being more aware of what happens, but I think that we need to learn in schools, amongst other places, more about the life on the platforms and how it works and what they need to be aware of and how they can also be more in control themselves to avoid certain things if they want to avoid it. So I think clearly literacy is important. We need to make sure that people have the sufficient skills. It's always difficult because the platforms are always adopting and developing, and we cannot always be so fast with our teaching system. But I think we need to be aware that it's not one way or the other. It's both. We need control, we need audits, we need better systems, better legislation in place, but we also need to develop better skills amongst the citizens so they know what to be aware of.
Gotcha. I'm conscious of time, and so I'd also ask the people watching in to please send in your questions. But I just want to focus on finally just on what can be done in the short term. So we obviously have a variety of different rules and regulations coming down the pipe, at least here in Europe, and to Samuel's point, hopefully maybe in DC at some point in the future. If I gave you a magic wand and said, okay, what is the key point here? To Roger and Samuel, I just maybe focus on what would you like to come out of any regulation? What is the one thing that it needs? And Crystal, as you're someone who's involved in this, I'll make it a bit more difficult for you and say, what thing would you like to change on the DSA proposals? So maybe you can start with Roger. What if I give you a magic wand, what would you like to see the regulation hit on?
So what I would most like to see is a regulatory approach adopted that the platforms welcome and realize they can work with. And we've got to recognise that they've got some legitimate concerns about how this is going to operate in terms of people's freedoms, and they're entitled to often it may be a smokescreen, but sometimes there's some reality there, but also thinking about how it's going to work in terms of their commercial interests, which are again their legitimate interests in this conversation. People want these products to exist, so we have to find a way of doing this that works for the platforms. And what I would most like to see come out of this is an enthusiastic move by leading platforms towards engaging constructively with the questions of how do we design audits and how do we enable people to do the sort of research that will properly answer the legitimate public concerns that something terrible might be happening, and that they recognize that this is a road that they can support and engage actively with. And I think if we get to that point, we will be making real headway. I think if it turns into a very combative process, it will just take a lot longer to make progress.
Thank you. Samuel.
Sure. So I'm a researcher first. So the first thing I would ask for is it to be legislated that there is a third-party oversight of what the companies are doing and how. So not just that there's sort of audits taking of how the algorithms work, but also access to data for academics. There can be some kind of vetting process through which that occurs. But right now, the access to data is just not there in any kind of clear, consistent way. Simultaneous to that, I would like to see some legislation that enforces collaboration between the platforms, because most of the fixes that we see happening internally at the platforms are happening at one platform or another. So Google is doing something, Facebook is doing something. We don't see a lot of interaction with them. We don't see a lot of data sharing. Of course, they're competitors, I understand. But at the same time, the problem that we're talking about, the problem of misinformation and this problem of disinformation as well, is a multi-platform, internet-wide phenomena. And without platform collaboration, we will not see progress be made. Finally, here in the United States, at least, we have senators like Mark Warner and Amy Klobuchar proposing things like the Safe Tech Ad, which works to prevent things like extremist speech, fraud, and harassment. Many times this stuff is connected actually to disinformation because it's for hire firms that do this. And so if we can target them in other ways, particularly around much more specific illegal harms, then we can actually make progress on the dis and misinformation front as well.
Wonderful. And Crystal, we are running over, so I'd just ask you, unfortunately, to keep it very brief, but one thing in the DSA you would like to change, please?
Well, I think getting the DSA in itself is a major step ahead. We will get democratic oversight. We will make sure that the platforms need to be accountable for what they're doing. So in many ways, I think access, explanation of algorithms, accountability, audits, etc. I think that we are trying to move in that direction, and I'm sure that once it's adopted, things will be a bit better. Maybe we will not save the whole world at the same time with the DSA, but we will take a major step in the right direction.
Wonderful. And with that, I would just say thank you so much to our panelists for this really interesting conversation. And next up, you stuck with me for one more panel. We have the European Commission Vice President for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourova, in a couple of minutes. So please stay tuned. Thank you very much.